Thank you everyone for coming to the University of Atlantia. We are doing these wonderful instructor spotlights, and the instructor we wish to spotlight this time was Elias de Birton, who is Armiger in the Kingdom of Atlantia. Did a wonderful class on English Royal Forest that was highly praised at the February University, and so we asked him to go ahead and if he would be willing to host us again. So thank you all for joining us. And from this, I will pass it over to Elias.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. So as y'all heard, I'm going to be talking about English Royal Forests. And I am of the school of teaching where I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So some of the questions that I'm hoping to answer with this class are: what was a royal forest? What am I talking about? How did royal forests develop in England specifically? What officials were responsible for maintaining the forests? What was the administrative structure of English royal forests in their height? And then how did those royal forests change over time? Because nothing is static. And so when we talk about forests, with reference to English royal forests, I'm not necessarily talking about a group of trees. So a forest is quickly defined as effectively a hunting preserve for the monarch. It is not necessarily a woodland. So I've got a couple images of land that was previously royal forest. Up on the slide here, up at the top, I've got an image of Seward's Cross, which was one of the boundary markers of the Royal Forest of Dartmoor. And the moors in England are mostly scrubland, rock, low growth, very few trees. And then underneath that, I have sort of, I think, the classic Royal Forest, Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, which has been forested, they believe, since the last ice age. So forests can comprise of a wide range of landscapes. The defining factor of a forest is that it is an area that is subject to forest law. And before I really dig into forest law, I want to talk a little bit about commons, because really we have to contrast forests with commons to really get an understanding of what is going on here. So commons were land within a manor where tenants, folks who lived on the land owned by the lord of the manor, could do certain things. And some of the things they could do might be pasture their animals. They could graze their livestock. They could allow swine to forage for nuts and acorns. They might be able to collect fallen wood for fuel to burn. Or in the same sort of vein, they might be able to dig up peat, depending on what kind of landscape we're talking about here. And sometimes commons were afforested, were brought under the purview of forest law, and sometimes forests, royal forests, were disafforested and became commons. And so you really sort of have to understand the tension between these two ideas when we think about forest law. And again, that is what really defines a forest. And so a reasonable question would be, well, then what is forest law if it's so important to what I'm going to be talking to you all about? So forest law protects game animals and their habitat for the monarch's hunting. And you could break forest law in a couple different ways. You could violate laws that protect the vert, the greenery, the vegetation, or you could break laws protecting the venison. And venison did not exclusively mean deer, it meant game animals more generally. And so the structure of forest law was outside of common law. It was enforced by separate officers and separate courts. And there was this really, I thought it was a very funny quote from Richard Fitznigel in his very important book, The Dialogue of the Exchequer, where he discussed the English administrative system late in the 12th century, where he says, the forest has its own laws based, it is said, not on the common law of the realm, but on the arbitrary legislation of the king. So what was done in accordance with forest law is not called just without qualification, but just according to forest law. So he seemed pretty salty about this whole situation, which I thought was very funny. And so we have this strange set aside set of laws that apply to certain land. And it's just this very odd, almost arcane sort of system. And so one thing I was really interested in was, how did we get there? How did this odd system develop in England? And so what I want to do to sort of go through that history is I want to do a really both generalized and narrow review of a particular avenue of European history, because I'm going to be jumping across about 1,000 years in this talk, and I want y'all to have an idea of who I'm talking about, where, and when. And so this is going to be very generalized, but it's also going to be very narrowly focused on different principalities and countries and empires and folks that I'm going to be talking about. So if I ignore your time or place of interest, please don't be offended. If I make a very generalized statement to the point that it's almost incorrect, again, please don't be offended. I'm just trying to give y'all sort of a quick run through so y'all understand what I'm talking about when I blow through about 1,000 years pretty quickly. So I'm going to start with Rome, as so many things do when we are talking about European history. And Rome is really going to be our first stop when we talk about hunting law, land ownership law, things like that. Rome had diplomatic contact with the Middle East under the Sasanian Empire. Also had contact, I wouldn't call it diplomatic, with the Franks in what would become France and the Britons in what would become England. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the Western Roman Empire fell. Some folks now are challenging that idea and saying it changed, but if nothing else, contracted. The Byzantine Empire rose, and then various other groups of folks created new kingdoms, one of which being Francia under the Merovingians. We also had Germanic migration from Scandinavia and Germany, or what would become Germany, into England, which gave us the Anglo-Saxons. When Rome continued to fall, the Lombards conquered much of Italy. And then under the Carolingian dynasty, Francia reestablished diplomatic contacts with both the Byzantine Empire and again the Middle East, only now under the Abbasid Caliphate. The Carolingians then conquered the Lombards, expanding Francia, but then Francia broke back apart into West, East, and Middle Francia in the 9th century. The Norse in the late 9th, early 10th century started to conquer parts of Britain and West Francia, forming the Danelaw in Britain and Normandy in West Francia. The Anglo-Saxons were able to reunite Britain briefly before we all know what happened in 1066. The Normans conquered the Anglo-Saxons, forming the Anglo-Normans. And then by the time you get to about the 13th century, we've sort of got the cultural identities of England and France. And so again, very quick overview of some of the groups of folks I'm going to be talking to and how they were interacting and how forest law sort of developed among all these different groups. And so, like I said, I'm going to start with Rome. So Rome had a legal concept called res nullius, which literally translates to nobody's thing. And that is ownerless property that can be acquired by occupying it with the intent to own. And a lot of the times this gets applied to squatting or occupying land or abandoned buildings, but it was also applied to game, to wild animals. And so these wild animals were considered res nullius until they were captured or killed, and that was considered the occupying with the intent to own. And at that point, they became the property of the hunter. Interestingly, land ownership did not change this. So you could go onto someone else's land, kill a wild animal. You couldn't kill their livestock, but you could kill a wild animal. And the fact that it happened on land owned by someone else did not change the fact that this thing was now yours. There was a unless to that, though, and that was unless a landowner made an effort to prevent entry. So built a wall, tried to keep people out. Of course, the aristocrats and emperors took advantage of this and began to build enclosed game parks. And so by building walls, by enclosing an area that contained these wild animals, these game animals, they asserted ownership over those animals. This was thought to be imported from the Middle East, from the paradises, these walled gardens and hunting grounds of Sasanian shahs. They were imported by the Roman emperors, and then the aristocrats copied the Roman emperors. So one example of an imperial game park was constructed in the 4th century CE by Valentinian I, and this consisted of 55,000 acres. So we're not talking about a small amount of land. We're talking about enclosing large, large areas to assert ownership over the land and the animals within. And this was surrounded by 45-mile-long, 6-foot-high stone walls, so the sort of engineering projects that the Romans were so good at. So the Franks, when they rose under the Merovingian dynasty, had laws about natural resources, but they really continued the concept of res nullius, nobody's thing, from Roman law, because they had laws that protected the natural resources found on private property, but not the wild animals on that property. So there's a couple of laws that prohibit stealing wood or from grazing your swine on someone else's land. So those acorns and such belong to the landowner. You can't just have your pigs eat them. And then the Ripuarian law in the 7th century CE made some interesting distinctions. It actually specified 3 different types of woodlands. So communal woodlands that belong to a community, royal woodlands that belong to the monarch, and then woodlands that belong to someone else, so not the community and not the king. But those laws only protected the natural resources. They outlawed things like timber theft, but they also had the same penalty regardless of whose wood you were stealing. So you could steal wood from a community or you could steal wood from the king and you were still in trouble, but you were going to be charged the same fine. The king couldn't have almost extortionate fines for stealing his wood in particular. And so the word Ferestus starts to show up relatively late. It's not a Roman Latin word. It shows up in the 7th century and was used to describe a wilderness that was owned by the monarch. So what was previously a Sue Regis was now a Ferestus. And there's a couple different thoughts of where this word came from. It could be from foris est, which is Latin for it is outside. That's not to say it is outside as in it is out of doors, but it is outside as it is outside of the public purview. It is land that is set aside for the king. Or it could come from first, which was Frankish for enclosure, or it could be both, or it could be neither. But we start to see this term start to pop up that will become the English forest in the 7th century to describe royal woodlands. And so Merovingian royal forests share some traits that I told you about English royal forests. They were not exclusively woodlands. They usually included wooded areas, but they also contained meadows, mountains, waterways, and importantly, manors and farms. People were living within the boundaries of this territory. And they were also under the supervision of royal officials. So we get sort of the first incidents of who we will call foresters in English royal forests. Again, though, Merovingian forest charters don't talk about hunting rights. The wild animals don't belong to anyone. We're still using this concept of res nullius. Foresters did sometimes try to prevent people from entering royal forests, but it seemed like they were prioritizing natural resources, again, guarding against wood theft and things like that, rather than trying to protect game specifically. So this seems to have changed under the Carolingians, especially under Charlemagne. Charlemagne's father, Pippin III, sort of started to seed these changes a little bit on his deathbed when he granted the forest of Yvelines to a monastery where he wanted to be buried. And as part of this grant of this forest, he included wild animals. So he said, not only am I granting you these lands, I am granting you these wild animals. These wild animals are now yours. And so that's sort of this, the beginning of this notion that the king could grant ownership of wild animals because he owned those wild animals. And Charlemagne expanded on this idea. He confirmed his father's grant of this forest to Saint-Denis. Would be kind of a jerk move if he didn't. But he restricted the hunting rights a little bit. Now he didn't say you own all the animals, you're going to own some of the less prestigious game. And in kind of a funny twist, he pretty much made the abbot his forester because he forbade hunting and trapping in the forest except for by permission of the abbot. So now the abbot not only was restricted in what he could hunt, he was in charge of making sure other people weren't hunting when they weren't supposed to. Again, Charlemagne sort of further expanded on the distinction between forests as forestes and woodlands as sylvae. So the idea that there's this particular term that designates a royal woodland or a royal piece of land. And then in 802, skipped a little bit, in 802, Charlemagne banned hunting in the forest. So he kind of pushed it to that logical extreme of, I own these wild animals, no one else can hunt them but me. And it's entirely possible that he was influenced by the Lombards who were in Italy, and he conquered the Lombards a little more than 25 years before that, because the Lombard kings had private wilderness areas that they called Gahagia. And the Lombards also had this notion where there was a legal distinction between land ownership and hunting rights. So you could own land, but not have the right to hunt on it. And then Charlemagne also had diplomatic contact with the Middle East under the Abbasid caliphs and the Byzantine empires. And that likely influenced his decision to revive walled game parks. He interestingly called these brugili rather than vivaria, which is what the Romans were calling them, which suggests that we don't have a continuous line from Rome to Charlemagne. Some folks have posited that that means that there was a break in this tradition and it was revived by Charlemagne as opposed to simply continued. So Charles III was the Carolingian king of West Francia after Francia was broken up among Charlemagne's descendants, and he granted land to the Viking leader Rollo in 911 because he wanted Rollo to stop trying to conquer his land. And so he said, hey, how about I make you a duke and I grant you this land if you protect the Seine from other Viking raiders, and you have to convert to Christianity. And so Rollo said, okay, yeah, good deal. And so he became the Duke of Normandy. He swore fealty to Charles III. And as part of becoming the Duke of Normandy, he also took control of royal forests and game parks that were in that land. And so it's actually pretty hard to find much information about early 11th century Norman charters and forests. There's not a ton out there really about what the Normans were doing in the early 11th century with regard to land ownership and hunting rights and things like that. So foresti are mentioned. Interestingly, they're mentioned as being held by the Duke and by lords. So it seems like foresti are not limited to royalty or dukes in 11th century Normandy. They are held by nobility. We also see reference occasionally to brogili, so that term that Charlemagne was using, hii, which are enclosures. We'll kind of come back to that word in a minute. And foresters. But again, it doesn't seem like just the king or just the duke was in charge of these foresti, because there was a peasant movement in the Seine early in Duke Richard II's reign, so in the early 11th century. That seems in part motivated by the restrictions on access to woodland and water resources, so cutting through woodland or having access to fishing and things like that. But it wasn't just against the Duke. It seems to have also been motivated by feudal lords placing these restrictions on the peasants. And so, again, it doesn't seem like foresti were the only ones or foresti were exclusively owned by the dukes or by royalty in early 11th century Normandy. And that's really interesting because most of the time you hear the story that William the Conqueror, just completely imposed this Norman system on the English when he conquered England in the late 11th century. But it doesn't seem like what we get in England is entirely what was happening in Normandy. And then there's also a question of, was there some form of forest law present in England prior to the Norman conquest?
Quick question. Baron Alfgar has asked, are the Dukes of Broglie connected with the Brogili?
I am not. That's a very good question. I do not know. I was introduced to the term entirely as a term used to describe this land owned by these enclosed hunting parks.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for letting me know there was a question. And so, going back to England, there is sort of some debate on what was happening in England before the Norman conquest. There's some archaeological evidence that seems to suggest that patterns of venison consumption, patterns of game animal consumption were shifting in the 10th and 11th centuries, so about 100 years or so before the Norman conquest. And we see an increase in game consumption at high status archaeological sites and a decrease in game consumption at low status archaeological sites. And so it seems like there's some sort of societal pressure that's sort of pushing this stratification of venison consumption. We also see a term, haga, which sounds a little bit like hii. It's plural hagen, that appears in late Anglo-Saxon charters. So we're talking 11th century Anglo-Saxon charters. So this is translated as a hedge or an enclosure. And confusingly, it occurs in both rural and urban spaces. So it seems to have a couple different meanings, or at least a more broad meaning of just sort of a boundary. But when used in more rural areas, it does seem to describe some sort of boundary in a forested area. Sort of more specifically, a term pops up in a charter in 1045 that is der Hage, which is a deer enclosure specifically, so specifically a hedge or an enclosure for deer. And in this charter, the person who is making this legal document is specifically differentiating this deer enclosure from the surrounding woodlands, from the surrounding wood. And so again, we're sort of getting hints that something is happening with regard to constraining the movement of deer within wooded areas. A lot of these hagen appear to have, after the Normans conquered England, have directly evolved into Norman hunting parks. So before the Normans, there was a hagen. After the Normans, there was a hunting park. There's also some evidence that late Anglo-Saxon kings were engaging in recreational deer hunting. So deer hunting as a status symbol where you have dogs and you have horses and you're having this, wild chase through the woodland, and then you sort of ceremonially dispatch of the deer at the end of the hunt, as opposed to, hunting with a bow or hunting with a net or with a trap or something like that. Very similar to what was considered the sort of Norman style of hunting, this very sort of ceremonial style of hunting that continued through the High Middle Ages. There's also, this one's a little bit of a tricky one. So there's a law attributed to Canute, who was the King of England in the early 11th century. He was also the King of Denmark and Norway, where he restricts hunting to landowners and he forbids hunting on royal land. However, this law, the authenticity of this document is under debate. Some folks believe that it's actually a forgery that was produced in the 12th century by Henry II to sort of say, hey, even before the Normans showed up, y'all had these hunting laws. So, this is a very English thing. There's debate on that. So I think it's interesting, but it's a, not something you can really go one way or the other on. Sort of jury's still out on that one. And so we get to the early Anglo-Norman forests. So we've got William I, William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, whatever you prefer to call him, was establishing forests that were recorded in the Domesday Book. And the New Forest was especially badly talked about. People especially disliked that one. But interestingly, as we saw in Normandy, some nobility are also holding forests. So especially along the Welsh marches, along the border with Wales, which William did not conquer, we see lords, rather than just the king, holding these forests. And while these were used as hunting grounds, they also included fields and meadows, and they were used as these multi-use productive areas. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of information on how early Norman kings administered their royal forests. There's some evidence that foresters were employed, but there was a lot of disruption after William II and Henry I. And so we just don't have a ton of information on how those were administered. There's some evidence that forest law may have been enforced through the shire court, so through the local court system, as opposed to this set aside court system that we get in the 13th century. And it appears that foresters under William II, William Rufus, were protecting game animals and preventing what's called a sarding, which is where you remove trees and undergrowth to prepare land for cultivation. So you're very much changing the landscape and making it less habitable to game animals. And so under Henry I, we actually get some of the broad strokes of forest law as it will be in the 13th century, when it's at its height. And so you couldn't clear land, you couldn't cut and burn wood, you couldn't carry bows or spears in the forest, you couldn't, be out to go get you a deer. So there was the practice called hambling, which is where you would cut the leg sinews of dogs that were owned by folks who lived in the forest so they couldn't chase deer. There were restrictions on grazing livestock in the forest, on building in the forest, and there was a system in place for what to do if you found evidence of poaching. And so Henry I primarily punished folks who broke forest law with fines, because forest law was a great vehicle for raising money. But if you really got on his bad side, especially when we get into things like poaching, things like that, punishments could also include blinding, castration, or death. But while that's really bad and really draconian, exemptions to forest law were relatively frequent, especially for monasteries. So monasteries that were within royal forests, a lot of the times, the folks at the monastery had a little bit more freedom to do what they wanted or needed with the land around the monastery. And under Henry I is when we get evidence of the first forest ear, which was a circuit court, so a special court for the education of forest law. And so again, these seeds of what the system will become at its height. The trouble was Henry I died without a direct male heir, and so there was a good bit of turmoil where folks were way more worried about who the ruler of England was than they were about what was happening with forest law and whether or not you were allowed to cut down a particular tree or clear land for cultivation. And so forest law administration was disrupted until Henry II, until the return of some stability. And so under Henry II, this is where we really get forest law taking the form that it would exist as for a few centuries. And so under Henry II, no one could have a bow, arrows, or dogs in the royal forests. We backed off a little bit on the laming dogs. Instead of cutting the leg sinews, they would instead remove several toes from one of the forefeet to, again, make it so they couldn't chase deer as effectively. This is referred to as lawing. Landowners with woods within the forest were required to hire their own foresters. So if you owned land within a royal forest, you had to have folks that took care of it. And landowners with woods within the forest could cut wood for their own use, but they couldn't sell wood and they couldn't give it away. So they were allowed to use it themselves to maintain their fences, build their buildings, but they couldn't turn a profit off of it. They also had to be careful about how much they cut, because if you cut too many trees, defined as, which is called wasting, which is when you could stand on the stump of one tree and see 5 other tree stumps looking around, or clearing land for cultivation without permission. You couldn't do that again, even if you were a landowner within the royal forest. And each county within a royal forest was required to appoint 12 knights to inspect the forest and make sure everyone was following the above rules. And those are called regarders. And 4 knights to collect rents for grazing livestock within the forest. So those are called agisters. These were very unpopular jobs. Knights would pay the king a fair amount of money to be excused from doing these duties because folks did not like the person who came around to make sure their dog's toes were cut off. This did not make you a lot of friends. So Angevin forest law. So as it sort of evolved under Henry II's line, the offenses were still mostly fines, but we could still blind, castrate, or kill someone for violating forest law. So it sort of got divided into those two categories of offenses against the vert and offenses against the venison. So if you cut down a tree or you cleared land you weren't supposed to, that was an offense against the vert. That was going to be fines. Nobody got castrated for cutting down a tree. Under Henry II, you did get some physical punishment, but it tended to be after several incidents of poaching.
Good question.
Yes.
Someone was asking, was it the job of the regarder to dispense justice for violations, like the snipping of dogs' toes, or
so we will get into that.
Whose job was that?
So that was actually the role of the various forest courts. Depending on what you did, you would have to be involved with sort of different levels of this forest justice system. And we will go through sort of what sort of offenses will have what sort of punishments and what sort of interaction with these various forest court systems. So it was not their job to dispense justice, but it was their job to make note and make sure that the offender showed up when they were supposed to for the court where they would deal with not having their dog's toes cut. So yes, excellent question. We will get there. Richard I, so I guess kind of backed off on things a little bit. He established that the regard, which is what the regarders did, that inspection of the royal forest was to be held every 3 years. So we have sort of a timetable for it. He added some rules about carts and grazing pigs within the forests during the summer. And then as opposed to killing people for poaching, now it was just blinding and castration. I don't know if that's better, but it was a change. And then we get to John. And honestly, I think when you think of royal forests, most folks think of John. Folks have, read the Robin Hood stories and all of that. And for all that sort of, I think, and I had this idea when I started this project that everyone thinks John was just horrible with regard to forest law. He was, but he didn't change forest law and he didn't expand the royal forests. He actually worked within the laws set under Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. But he made the whole system more efficient. He got every inch he could get out of folks by applying the existing forest policies. So he got very good at enforcing forest law and collecting the fines in order to raise revenue. John never had any money. Basically, whenever he needed some money, which was most of the time, he would send out the circuit justices on an ear to try to levy some fines. And he also liked to use forest law against his political opponents, where he would have regarders go and check, and they would find a building that had been up for generations, but had never actually been technically approved. And so he'd say, I will knock down your building unless you give me a lot of money, because technically you shouldn't have this building or you shouldn't have this cleared land. So he actually didn't change the laws. He just was really good at enforcing them. So good at enforcing them that forest law was mentioned in the Magna Carta. So by the 13th century, about a quarter of England was designated a forest. So a lot of land was royal forest. And this may have contributed to the tensions between John and the northern barons, who would rebel against John, because there were extensive forests in the north, more so than in the south of England. And so the restrictions imposed by forest law may have been one of the things that really sort of got the barons riled up. And some of their early demands, so before the Magna Carta in earlier documents, they demanded that John disafforest all forests created by Henry II, Richard I, and John. So the last three kings, any forest they created, they wanted them disafforested to no longer be royal forest. And they also asked that physical punishment no longer be enforced on or be inflicted on those who killed deer. So no more blinding, no more castration. Have to do something else. And so this was so important that the Magna Carta included articles that pertain to the forests. And so John agreed to disafforest all forests that he created, which was kind of a nothing promise because he didn't really create any forests. And then he said, yeah, I guess the foresters were kind of being not cool. I'll deal with that. We'll investigate. That was, again, sort of a nothing promise. But this sort of idea of these being important issues that needed to be addressed in these large legal documents eventually led to the Forest Charter establishing the framework for forest law in the 13th century. This document was written by the advisors of Henry III, who was 10 when he became king after John died. And so this was largely a way to try to sort of make peace with the rebelling barons. And pretty much they rolled back the clock and reset the forests, the land that was forest, to the time of Henry II's coronation. So they said, okay, Henry II, Richard I, John, all their forests, they're disafforested, they're not forest anymore. And some of the additional provisions of the Forest Charter of 1217 were that, again, we would go back to holding those regards every 3 years, have a manageable schedule, not be, dragging folks to ears every time the king needed money. And the number of foresters, so you couldn't have just a ton of foresters, would actually be set by those regarders, by those knights who answered to the sheriff rather than the forest administrative system. Swain motes, which started as when you paid rent for grazing pigs and livestock, but sort of turned into courts, would be held only 3 times a year, and attachment courts, which were the most local courts, and we'll talk about these, would be held every 40 days. So again, very sort of saying, here's what the situation is going to be. Landowners within the forest would have more privileges for grazing their livestock and building on their own property, but they couldn't damage the covert, they couldn't damage the wild spaces where game lived. And if you killed deer, you could be punished by fine, you could be punished by imprisonment, and you could be punished by exile. But I guess we won't blind castrate or kill you for that. So progress. And this really set the framework for forest law in England at its height in the 13th century. So let's talk about moving through this system a little bit. So what not to do in a royal forest. And remember, about a quarter of England was forest in the 13th century. So do not kill the king's deer. That's a big one. I think everyone knows that one. It seems reasonably easy to deal with. Don't carry a bow or arrows in the forest because folks might think you're going to kill the king's deer. Don't keep dogs, especially hunting dogs that are unlawed, that might chase the king's deer. Don't graze livestock without paying the various fees you needed to pay, the various rents you needed to pay to graze the livestock. And evidently deer don't like goats, or they thought deer didn't like goats, and so goats just weren't allowed in the forest at all. You can't cut trees, especially to the point of waste. You can't collect fallen wood, except for if you have those privileges and if the foresters are watching you to make sure you're not collecting more than you're supposed to. You can't dig peat for burning. You can't clear the woodland for cultivation, no asarting. You can't build structures or fences without paying the appropriate rent. You can't tan hides or do other smelly, noisy activities that the deer don't like. And importantly, these all applied to landowners within the forest. So if you were a landowner, if you were the lord of a manor, you still could not do these things on your own land. Again, there were some privileges that were usually granted to you for personal use of wood, things like that. But even if you owned land within the royal forest, the king's use for that land trumped yours. And so all of this was enforced by a fairly complicated system of administrators. So at the top of the heap, we have the crown, the monarch, and then I have divided up the different levels of the administration of forest law from central government, contracting to region, contracting to county. Let me get my laser pointer. Contracting to individual forests, and then bailiwicks or rides, which were administrative areas within a forest. And so under the king is the chief forester, also known as the master forester or the chief justice of the forest. And this is the person who oversaw forest administration on the kingdom level, because that's a lot. In 1239, that job was divided up into two jobs. The justice of the forests north of the Trent River and the justice for the forests south of the Trent River. So under the justices of the forest was the warden, and the warden was in charge of a specific forest. And he had a lot of duties that related to receiving information from the king relevant to the forest, arresting lawbreakers, dealing with evidence, taking possession of land or goods or livestock if that was somehow involved in something that's a violation of forest law. He also had some tasks involving feeding the deer in the winter to make sure they survived, collecting rents and appointing foresters. In all likelihood, a lot of this was probably done by a deputy warden or sort of delegated to other folks involved in forest administration. Sergeants in fee answered to the warden. They did not have a specific bailiwick or district. They received land in exchange for sort of keeping an eye on the whole forest. Foresters in fee were landowners within the forest, and they paid the king for custody of a bailiwick, an administrative region in the forest. And as part of that, they got to collect wood. They were allowed to graze forests. They were allowed to keep dogs, things like that. So they got privileges and prestige as part of that deal. Your ordinary foresters were the law enforcement officers responsible for protecting the vert and the venison. And so they would walk or ride their bailiwicks. They would arrest offenders and present them in court. Rangers are a fairly late addition to the forest administration, and they became important in the 14th century when land became disafforested, because they would chase the deer back into the forest, because when the deer left the forest, now other folks could hunt it, and they didn't want that, so they would herd the deer back into the forest. Wood wards were private foresters that were employed by landowners, so they were subject to the authority of the landowner, but also to the warden. They had to swear an oath to the warden. And then the justices on ear I have them as sort of a separate category. They may have been under the authority of the justice of the forest, but there's also some evidence that some of them were common law justices. So this is one of those places where this actually gets a little more messy than I'm depicting it here. This is sort of the ideal. And so the justices on ear were itinerant judges that would ride circuits. They would oversee the forest ears, which were the highest level of forest courts. So if you were really in trouble, you had to deal with the justices on ear. The sheriff was the chief executive officer within a county, but he had some involvement in forest law administration. If that county was within a forest, he would collect fines, he would hold elections for verderers and regarders, and he was responsible for holding the regard, holding that inspection. The verderers were landowners within the forests who were elected. They were men of good standing within the community. They were elected to deal with the local courts and appraise damages, collect evidence of poaching, things like that. The regarders performed that regard, that general inspection. And then agisters were responsible for collecting payment for grazing livestock. It's a little unclear if they were under the sheriff because they were appointed by the sheriff, or if they were under the warden because the warden collected rent. Some period documents seem confused about under whose authority they ultimately end up. But I put them under the sheriff because he was the one who ultimately appointed them. So you've been caught violating forest law. Now what? Well, it depends on what you did. So let's say you did something that was not allowed, but wasn't a huge deal. Let's say you were caught gathering wind-fallen wood. You did not have right to vest over, but you needed some firewood. And so you didn't cut down a tree or anything, but you collected wind-fallen wood. So you will be presented at the attachment court, that local court, to the warden and the verderers by a forester who caught you. In all likelihood, that's probably where it will end. You probably won't have to deal with the court system any more than that unless you're a repeat offender. You'll be fined. So presented means, so you were not necessarily jailed until the court. A forester said, hey, you're in trouble. Don't go anywhere. Some of your property could potentially be seized as a surety. But you typically were not arrested. Typically being actually imprisoned was reserved for serious problems. But that's an excellent question. Thank you. And so you'll be fined. And so the fine is due at the next attachment court in 40 days. So let's say you were cutting wood. So now this is a bigger problem. You aren't just collecting wood off the ground, you cut down a tree. So this gets a little more complicated because the verderers, those locals appointed by the sheriff who are men of good standing, have to determine how much that wood is worth. So that's when we get into like sort of petty theft versus like larceny, things like that. And if it's worth less than 4 pence, I will answer. That's a good question. I'll answer in just a sec. If it was worth less than 4 pence, you had to find 2 folks to say, yeah, this person's okay. We promise we'll make him show up. And then you'll be fined. If it's worth more than 4 pence, you would have to pay the value of the wood. And then you would actually have to show up at the next forest year. You would have to be much more involved in the forest court system. So the fine was usually 12 pence. And so a little more than a pence a day was about the wages of an average laborer. So it was not nothing. So there'd be about 2 weeks' wages if you were a laborer. It could be crippling if they thought you were someone who should know better. So if it was someone who was very important and they wanted to teach you a lesson, the fines could be exorbitant because they were pissed and they thought you should know better, and they would levy a really high fine. So it depended on what you did and who you were. So there was some flexibility in the punishment. Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. And so let's say you did the big one. let's say you've been caught poaching the king's deer. So you'll be imprisoned. So this is when we get into imprisonment. And while you are imprisoned, you do not get fed by your jailer. Your friends and family will have to bring you food. If you don't have friends and family, you're in for a rough time. If you're wealthy, you may be released on bail. So 2 justice systems. Your property within the forest will be seized and entrusted to the warden to make sure you show up to the forest year. The meat of the deer that you poached will be given as alms to the local poor or sick, and the skin will be entrusted to the verderers as evidence. So they have the skin of the deer that you killed to use against you. And this will be dealt with at the forest year. And forest years, remember, were about 3 years apart. So you, depending on your timing, you could be imprisoned for a good little while. And then you will be fined based on your income or importance. So again, those fines are going to be about 12 to 40 pence for common folk. So again, for a laborer, 2 weeks to month and a half, 2 months' wages, but could be 1 to 500 marks. So very, very high sums for important folks. Again, depending on whether or not they think you should really know better. If you can't pay, you'll be imprisoned for a year and a day, and then you'll be released on the sureties of some upstanding folks who will say, yeah, we'll keep an eye on them. They won't do it again. If you can't find folks who will say, yeah, we'll keep an eye on them, they won't do it again. If you've really run out of friends by this point, you may be exiled from England. You may be forced to leave the country. So my understanding is they didn't really consider it their problem to feed you. So you could probably starve to death. And that is why some folks went with a different option. They would try to escape capture or fail to appear at the ear. And if you did that, then you became an outlaw. And I mean, given the situation, you can kind of get it. It wasn't a good situation. And so that was primarily how things worked in the 13th century. The Forest Charter was reconfirmed many times, but the boundaries of the forest, which was determined by what was called perambulations, you literally walked the boundaries of the forest, that became a political weapon. So depending on who was in a position to exert power, would determine sort of whether or not perambulations were happening. So Edward I ordered a new perambulation, a new checking of the boundaries of the forest in 1300, and that returned the forest boundaries to the time of Henry II's coronation. So again, rewinding back to that previously established mark. And that resulted in the disafforestment of a considerable area and formed what was called purlieu. That's why in the 14th century, we needed rangers, because suddenly there was forest that wasn't forest anymore. And so that was because the barons were threatening to revolt. So he had to do that. But then it was nullified. There was a papal bull involved. Things got crazy. And he nullified this perambulation in 1306. And to sort of try to smooth it over, he was like, but I will punish the forest officials who have been doing some not cool things. But then after he was defeated at Bannockburn and the barons were revolting again, they demanded new perambulations, and Edward II agreed to observe that 1300 perambulation. But then in 1323, Edward II said, actually, no, I want that land back. And so it went back and forth and back and forth. It was a political football until during the regency of Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, Edward III, to try to, calm some folks down after they were real upset with Edward II, Edward III confirmed the perambulation of 1300, and that became the legitimate boundaries of the forest. And that's really considered a turning point in the history of the English royal forest. Individual areas continued to be disafforested throughout the 14th century. Forest ears became less frequent, which made it really hard to actually deal with offenses against the venison because those had to be in a forest ear. And so slowly common law courts sort of started to fill that void. The development of a national system of taxation throughout the 14th century made the crown less dependent on the economic power of the royal forest. This changed further in 1390 when Richard II fundamentally changed hunting law and made hunting a privilege of the wealthy, even outside the forest. So now you could poach outside of a forest because no one with property values less than 40 shillings a year, so folks that, you know, were of means, could hunt deer, hare, conies, or other what was defined as gentleman's game. This was based on the idea that commoners would use hunting parties as cover to conspire against the landed gentry, which, I mean, can't really blame them, but that made poaching a problem across England as opposed to limited to just the royal forests. So that's a good question. Were these forest courts the precursor to common law courts? No, there were common law courts while there were forest courts. This was a separate legal system. And so that's why it was so sort of confusing and strange, because this was a whole separate system on top of an existing common law system. And so in the 15th century, forest court records are primarily recording trespasses against the vert, not the venison, because again, we're not having those forest ears. We can't actually punish people for poaching. In the late 15th century, Henry VII reissued the 1390 game law, and he made it illegal to hunt at night because, again, can't have folks be conspiring under the cover of hunting parties. And then Henry VII briefly tried to revive forest ears. So there was a forest ear in 1368, and then they started up again in 1487. So I hope the common law court sorted out anybody who was arrested for poaching in 1369, because otherwise they had a long wait. And in that, in one forest ear in 1488, over 100 presentments were made, and almost all for crimes against the venison, because again, forest ears were where you had to deal with these crimes against the venison, so crimes against poaching, things like that. And so they kept that up for a couple years, and then it sort of petered out again. Towards the end of his reign, Henry VII began to lease some of his more remote forests. He didn't feel like dealing with them. Exmoor and Naroch were two forests that were leased, and that lease was actually renewed for 300 years until they were eventually disafforested. And by the 16th century, the forests weren't really about hunting anymore. They weren't really about collecting rents anymore. They were about timber. They were about warships. That didn't change or didn't stop Henry VIII from trying to create a royal forest. He was the last king of England to try to create a royal forest, because of course he was, and he wanted to establish a hunting park near his Nonsuch palace. But throughout the 16th century, forest lands continued to be leased or sold to private landowners, and by sold I mean disafforested for money. And so that is where we are going to finish up our history for the SCA's period. So I'm going to tell you what I told you. So what was a royal forest? It was an area that was subject to highly restrictive forest law for the purposes of preserving natural resources, the vert and the venison, for the monarch. royal forests developed in England from sort of a long game of telephone, starting with Romans introducing enclosed hunting parks and Franks developing the idea that a region, a monarch could own all the wildlife within a region. William I, when he conquered England, then overlaid this system onto existing Anglo-Saxon hunting practices, which created a uniquely English system of forest law. The officials responsible for maintaining the forests were wardens, who oversaw sergeants and foresters in fee, foresters and rangers, as well as private woodland managers called wood wards. The sheriff of counties also was involved in the administration of forest law in that he directed verderers, regarders, and agisters. The law was administered through local attachment courts every 40 days, swain motes 3 times a year, and forest ears every 3 years. The royal forests were forced to change over time because taxation changed the economic importance of forests, and more restrictive hunting laws made poaching a common law offense. It no longer was exclusively the purview of the forest law courts. And while there were some attempts to get this all back up and running by the Tudors, really the 14th century is considered a turning point in when English royal forests headed on the way out. Those are my references, and I'd be happy to take any questions y'all might have.
Let me go ahead and stop the recording here, just in case anybody wants to use voice. And thank you so much, Elias. This was a wonderful class, and we really appreciate you offering it again. So,
Oh, thank you.